Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with
Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are here to help you learn to pause and be present, awaken your breath, and harness the ripple effects of mindfulness for radiant health.
We get you. We know you. We are you.
We have both been successful on the surface, yet struggling underneath. We have both had cluttered brains, been overwhelmed, and exhausted.
We're healers who have found solutions and want to share them with you.
Join us here to discover a better way.
Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast, an episode on compassion for oneself in the moment of uncertainty and difficulty. I wanted to start off with a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh, who transitioned earlier this past month. Only your compassion and your loving kindness are invincible and without limit. Our intention for today's podcast episode is to have a totally unscripted, honest conversation about an unexpected circumstance completely outside of one's control and how self-compassion can be used as a response.
And because it's unscripted and in the moment, just like this experience that happened, we will discover what we discover along the way. And we will take away the takeaways that pop up and come up in the midst of our discussion. So a new twist on the podcast, and we hope you all enjoy it. And I will add that nothing we're going to share today is medical advice. So do you want to share a little bit for our listeners? I imagine that many of our listeners here were there in this unexpected moment last night, but perhaps just a brief story about what happened, and then we can delve into some of the feelings and learnings and fun stuff that came up.
Sure, absolutely. And gratitude for the listeners who were able to make it last night and for your grace and compassion during and after. So basically, I had organized a very exciting book club with a world-renowned author and teacher. And unfortunately, she was unable to make it, but I didn't know at the time that she wasn't able to make it. And so during the entire event, there was a hope that she would miraculously appear. And yet at the same time, there was the desire to still hold space and to still have a helpful conversation about the book that we were discussing. And incidentally, the book that we were discussing was all about self-compassion. But the in the moment shame, catastrophizing, embarrassment that I was feeling was really intense and really uncomfortable. And I think I did the best that I could under the circumstances. And yeah.
From the outside, I just want to throw in that you did a beautiful job in the moment under the circumstances, showed tremendous grace and compassion. My guess is that you can't see that. And that's okay, because that wasn't what you felt inside. And I actually think that's probably the place to start for this conversation, is that you were in your body having your experience. And there were about 50 other people on a Zoom call in their own bodies having their own experience. And when we are you in that moment, it's embarrassing, full of shame, overwhelm, don't know what to do. And all of us are feeling compassion for you, except that in that moment, you're almost unable to feel it yourself because there's just this watershed of stress. And so I think that was it was a really interesting experience for me, and what I've seen in the reaction of others and the tremendous outpouring of support, right? That that sometimes watching someone else go through something difficult allows us to show up, not just with compassion for them, it helped me have more compassion for myself. Thinking like, wow, this happens to so many people and I can show myself compassion. And all of us here in this circle, watching you, and I will say watching you squirm, you weren't actually squirming, but we knew that inside it was very stressful, that we learned from that. And it allowed us, or certainly I'll speak for myself, allowed me to show myself more tender compassion around times that things haven't worked out right. And what's the other piece that's so interesting that's just popping up here is this idea of fault or not fault, right? And you felt it important to explain that you didn't know, and it's not your fault, and it's not this person's fault, not the person who couldn't show up. Like, and in our mind, that justifies everything. And yet it was what it was, and this happened, and there were circumstances out of control for both the special guest and for you. And I almost wonder, in a world that's really full of compassion, it wouldn't matter what happened or why, we could still show up with compassion in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there really was no fault yesterday, even though in the moment of the session, I was kind of mentally going through my head, did I send her the reminders? Did I do this? Did I do that? And I was kind of mentally checking off the check boxes to make sure that I had done what I could to ensure what I had advertised the event to be was actually going to happen. But also just realizing in the moment that we can still hold space for all of those uncomfortable feelings that we're experiencing internally, and yet at the same time hold space for the others who are there with us, and how that presents itself ultimately has like downstream effects that are unanticipated and somewhat kind of tragically beautiful in a way.
I think this session was tragically beautiful in a way. Tragic in the fact that I think many people were disappointed that they didn't get to hear from this author. However, I'm pretty certain we'll get another opportunity. And beautiful in the sense that her absence actually created a couple of things. One, a tremendous opportunity for you to practice self-compassion, and for us to all watch the power of compassion and really see compassion in action and what it can offer to everyone. And then also this reminder that we often have expectations of what things can be, but they still very often turn out way better than we expect, with so much more learning and so much more beauty. And the space without a world-renowned author, but specifically designed to talk about self-compassion, became this beautiful space in which the void, which we often think about, the void of the fancy speaker is the word that comes to mind, right, is also an opening, an opportunity. And so sometimes we think of a void as a negative or an absence, and yet it was this just tremendous opening opportunity portal for our community to grow and strengthen and have what turned out to be an incredibly enlightening, beautiful, tragically beautiful conversation.
Yeah, oftentimes the things that happen in a way that is unexpected is not fully 100% good or 100% bad. It is somewhere in between, and it was a good reminder in the moment to view it as such, especially since the circumstances were outside of my control and also the author's control. And so self-compassion all around, like for the author, for me, for all of the participants that showed up, and just a lot of gratitude.
I'm reminded of though the work around mistakes, and I just feel called to share that right now. And I know in this case, it was out of everyone's control, but sometimes it's not out of our control, or sometimes we made a mistake, or sometimes we send the author the wrong Zoom link, or sometimes we forget to remind them, or there's a time zone issue. And so sometimes it is someone's fault. And I think it's even more important to show self-compassion in that moment, and compassion, grace and compassion for everyone in that moment also. And I'm reminded of the chapter in Shauna Shapiro's book, Good Morning, I Love You, about extending your self-compassion in that moment, because that's where the learning comes. And that when we go into the shame and the blame and release all that norepinephrine and cortisol, we first of all cause ourselves harm and stress, but we also then don't learn from the experience and can't respond in the way that creates the space for everyone else around. And I want to give you kudos that I think you, whether those feelings popped in, I think your mindfulness training allowed you to let them float out and tap back into compassion, creating an even more compassionate space for the conversations that we had.
Thanks, Jessie. Mistakes are inevitable. We're only human. And just want to normalize encountering mistakes, whether you make them or you are part of the end result of someone else's mistake. They are part of life, and no better way to respond to mistakes, however they show up, except with self-compassion.
So what worked for you in the moment?
I think a transparency about what was happening, that from all of the communications that I had already had, the expectation was that there was going to be a presence. But then also just tapping into a little bit of humor and laughter at the situation. Because, yeah, I was definitely internally squirming, but I'm grateful that because of the years of mindfulness practice, I was able to lean upon that to still hold space, like to hold this like duality of spaces, like my internal environment that was really kind of going haywire and the fight or flight response was really triggered and activated, and yet still honor the intention. And it was the original intention of holding space to discuss self-compassion.
I want to offer that I think that the experience, the way it happened, exactly as it happened, taught us all, I want to say, just the most about self-compassion. And that, we talked a bit about fierce self-compassion and tender self-compassion, and it actually required both. And watching someone work through that and having to access it in the moment. And I think for many of us on the outside, thinking about what would I do, and noticing the discomfort it brought up for us. And I think, there were people who were also sort of involved in the event peripherally, and we had to come up with our own self-compassion, right? We'd encouraged people to come, and so there was just these layers upon layers upon layers of self-compassion. And I felt like the working through it literally in the moment, well, it taught me so much, but I have a sense from seeing the outpouring of support for you that many others learned from it as well.
Another kind of funny lesson is that literally the author was unable to show up at the predetermined time. But then the figurative and metaphorical kind of 10,000 foot view is technically, we don't need anyone else for self-compassion, right? And that self-compassion truly does come from within, and that no one else can tell you how to embody self-compassion. Like it's on us in that respect. And yes, of course, it's nice to have a external speaker who is a world-renowned expert on it. However, the work and the living of it really has to come from within.
Well, and we talk about what you practice grows, and you had to practice it, but we all also practiced it with you. I do think, and particularly in physicians and in medicine, I think I see so many people wanting the directions. Tell me how to be compassionate. Tell me how to be mindful. Give me the directions. We're used to knowing the protocol or the best practices. And so we feel comfortable having that best practice and that protocol. And yet, I think the model of mindfulness, common humanity, and kindness as a way of being mindfully self-compassionate is helpful, but 100%, that's just sort of this model out here. And the only way to explore self-compassion is to actually practice it.
Yeah, definitely same with mindfulness. Mindfulness being like the gateway to self-compassion as well. And with books and podcasts and talks and webinars and workshops, that is all great for providing a scaffold for it. But in order to use that scaffold and to embody it and to learn about topics like mindfulness and self-compassion, one really does have to practice it. Kind of like going back to the analogy of exercise. Like you can watch videos about exercise and read about exercise, but you won't get the actual benefits of exercise unless you actually do it.
And I'm going to use this moment to put in a plug for our retreat because, well, I noticed that a lot of people want to listen, and even people that I coach with, they want to listen to podcasts. They want you to give them book recommendations. They want to consume the information, but the actual benefits and the process come from the doing of it and the being in the moment and the practicing. And so we are offering a Mindful Healers retreat this summer in nature, and it will involve practicing mindfulness in the moment and practicing self-compassion in the moment. And that when we actually do these things, and one of the things that's kind of beautiful about a retreat is you're also not sitting on your mat by yourself. And so you have even more accountability and even more community to help you practice. And so I encourage any of you to join us. We would love to meet you in person. And just thinking back about this experience, part of the learning about self-compassion was that there was such a large community there with you experiencing this. And we were on Zoom. I imagine, in an in-person experience, imagine if we'd been sitting in a space where the speaker didn't show and we had to facilitate the conversation and how that might have felt. But that this power of community there would also be even more powerful.
Yes. Thinking if it was an in-person experience, it could have opened up doors for vulnerable sharing, just like it did last night. I don't think the level of vulnerability and openness would have happened had the author actually been there.
Yeah. And I actually seeing, 24 hours later, that the community, I think, was strengthened by it. There's a solidarity in having gone through an experience and practicing, in your case, self-compassion, but compassion for others. And I think it opened a portal for people to see what self-compassion really looks like in the moment, because everybody can resonate with hosting something, or the food doesn't show up for an event, or the speaker doesn't show up, or like something that goes not the way you expected, out of your control in the moment. And that like squirmy discomfort, there's no one there that couldn't recognize what that felt like. And so you were an incredible mindful teacher for all of us to watch. I know you didn't sign up for that, but I think looking at the sort of unexpected positives, not that it has to be half glass full all the time, but like it was how it was. And so what did we learn from it is something we often talk about with experiences like this. And how did it turn out better than you expect? And so that might be just a beautiful way of thinking about it.
Yeah, about any events that occur where you plan quite meticulously and then the outcome is rather different than what you had intended.
One other thing you brought up, I think is worthwhile talking a bit about, is the role of humor and laughter, and being able to access self-compassion through that. Because I often see, we were talking about the checklists and people wanting to read about it and know the answer. And I sometimes find getting to self-compassion that way feels forced and is hard for me to get there. And when I think about it that way, I kind of have to start with, well, I won't be mean to myself, and then I'll accept myself, and then I'll be kind to myself, and then I'll get to self-compassion. But when I access it through humor and laughter, and my guess is play, same thing, that it becomes all of a sudden, it's like a conduit that lands you there in a more kind of a magical way. Do you have thoughts about that?
I think with regards to how the humor was accessed was kind of a release of control. It was a necessity to be in that situation with presence, was actually the release of control. And then that allowed kind of the layer to lift, because in reality, I really didn't have control of the situation, but I hung on to the intention, and then letting go of the control of how this was going to go actually enabled the humor and the smile to finally just kind of land authentically.
What I see happened then, and this is just listening to what you said, is you went to your mindfulness first, because that's your go-to. And we often talk about, like, we have routes in our brain that are very well-formed and quick. And so in stress, because you've been practicing mindfulness so long, you went to mindfulness and you were able to be present. And then presence allowed you to get to the humor and the laughter. And so it reminds me that for each of us, we sort of have these neural circuitries that are really well honed, and knowing what yours is helpful. And then also potentially practicing one so that it is well honed, so that when you get into a difficult situation, you can access it with grace and compassion.
And that access can become kind of automatic, almost like a reflex.
Mm-hmm.
Not that it should be like a goal that we strive for necessarily, but more like a conditioning. Yeah. A conditioning that's offered to ourselves, not because we know from a logical and intellectual perspective that, yes, practicing mindfulness and self-compassion is so good for the brain and for the physiology of human bodies, but also just that it feels better. Like in the lived experience, when we can tap into those lifestyles and that embodiment, that philosophy, the experience of life is so much richer, even if it includes the most uncomfortable of difficulties. But then that just broadens the spectrum all the more.
It's the full spectrum we talk about a lot.
Yeah.
I'm thinking too, it's worthwhile mentioning this idea. So the way that you drop into mindfulness is very different than the way that I drop into mindfulness. And we've practiced it very differently. And I'm certain it's very different than the way many, many mindfulness experts tap into mindfulness. And so practicing for yourself, figuring out what it is. I drop into mindfulness with breathing and hand to heart. Like, so if I had been in your situation, I would have had hands to heart, like just not noticing that skin to skin and taking a few deep breaths over and over again, because I think there was the hope each time that someone new joining might be her, and that, but that we each have a way of accessing it that's different, and there isn't a right way to do it. And the other piece that I think is really relevant for our listeners is that in both of our cases, we practice it not when it's not needed in some way. So for me, doing regular yoga and practicing mindfulness in nature on a regular basis, sitting on the bluff at the beach and doing my mindful meditation in my own way, then your parasympathetic nervous system knows what to do in these moments. And so then you have it accessible. And so that's the value of sort of practicing these things outside. And I want to put in a plug for practicing self-compassion outside. Like any little moment where something doesn't go right, or you notice that underlying current of judgment. I work with a lot of people who, especially high achievers and physicians, people in medicine, we have a judgment, like a whole judgment app. I like to think about it, right? We just judge, judge, judge. That's how we push ourselves to move forward. And so can you set the intention perhaps that when you go into judgment, it gets turned on and it's just on autoplay, that you practice your mindful self-compassion or kindness, whatever words work for you, so that it becomes something that is second nature over time. And you can slowly, slowly, slowly turn off the other app so it doesn't show up in its normal way.
Beautiful reflections, Jessie. And I'll share what I was talking to you about before we pushed play a record for this podcast, is that a lot of these skills that we're talking about and that we're trying to model, this is fighting against 30,000 years of hardwired neural circuitry with a fight or flight response, right? Like our reptilian primitive brains still dominate in the 21st century. And to give ourselves some grace and compassion for that, and to normalize it when it shows up, because that's what it was made to do. It's definitely going to show up at any sign of threat. Now, 21st century threat is rather different than, 200 BC threat. And yet we still react in the very similar way. And it doesn't serve us now in the 21st century to go full-fledged into a fight or flight mode. And so, yeah, just self-compassion all around for wanting to rewire our brains in a way that serves us better now.
And to remind people, I think many of us, myself included, wish that we would rewire faster. And if we haven't rewired and we still go into the fight or flight, that we could have done it better, we should have done it better, we should do it better next time. And what I would like to offer is you're automatically going to go into that fight or flight. Like the chance to change is there once you're already squirming inside, once you're already embarrassed, once you already are judging yourself, feeling shame, blame, guilt, whatever it is. It's when you notice that's where you get to pause and notice or be present, and then decide with intention what you're going to do next. And so that's sort of practicing compassion in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. With the noticing and the pause to allow yourself to feel the feelings in the moment. Neuroscientist Jill Bolte Taylor notes that we feel emotions only for 90 seconds. But it's what we tell ourselves and the stories that we make up. That's how emotions seem to be prolonged, and where we tend to get over-identified with our emotions. So just offering that.
Shall we share a few reflection questions from this lovely experience that we've been chatting about?
Yes, I think this would be a perfect time. So, dear listener, how do you think you might use self-compassion in your own moments of difficulty? And what might happen if you set the intention from here on out that you will use moments of difficulty to bring self-compassion in as a response?
And what can you take away from watching someone else work through a tough situation? If you can see that they should show themselves self-compassion, can you use that as a way to give yourself permission to practice more self-compassion?
As always, we're so grateful for you listening and for your support. Please, if you found this podcast helpful, leave us a 5-star review and share with others that might benefit.
And we would love to have you join us to practice mindfulness and self-compassion, either at one of our retreats for one-on-one coaching, to establish or grow or up-level your own mindfulness practice. You can find out more about how to work with us in person or virtually in the show notes. Stay on after the sound of the singing bowl for another mindful self-compassion practice in the moment. As always, if you want to declutter your mind, be more present, and start truly living your one wild and precious life, come find us at the mindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Work with one of us.
Work with both of us.
Start or up-level your mindfulness practice.
Discover how mindful coaching can change your life.
Or even better, do both as part of our Mindful Healers programs and retreats. You can find links to find out more about our programs and join our communities at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Reach out and get started on your journey to a life better lived today.
The content of this podcast is not meant to be medical or life advice. If you choose to participate in our mindful moments, please do so safely. Welcome to this mindful moment. Please practice only if it's safe for you to do so. We have introduced this practice before. It's the self-compassion break. But I think that it is so important for us to continue to practice because what we practice grows. And with self-compassion, we could all use a little more practice. So inviting you to close eyes or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you, inviting you to bring hands to heart, just pushing a little bit against the chest and noticing that interface between your hands and your chest. And conjuring up a moment of difficulty that was recently experienced, perhaps not the most difficult moment, but something that caused perhaps mild to moderate discomfort. Remembering perhaps the body sensations, the circumstances, the emotions that were in those moments of difficulty. Noticing aspects of that circumstance in this way is mindfulness. Simply noticing and acknowledging the moments of difficulty as they are, and as they are for your own lived experience. And then reminding yourself that amongst the billions of people that reside on this earth, there are many people just like you who are experiencing a similar difficulty, and that you are not alone in this moment of suffering. You are not alone. And then asking yourself the question of, how can I be kind to myself in this moment? How can I show myself kindness in this moment of difficulty? Simply because it's a moment of difficulty and suffering is here. And perhaps it's shifting the hand that is closest to your chest into a fist, embodying fierce self-compassion with an open palm resting atop that. A symbol of solidarity, of having your own back. Or inviting you to welcome in some gentle, soothing touch. Coming back to the tender hand to heart of both palms being open. Whatever would serve you the most in this moment, whatever would serve you in bringing kindness for yourself. And then inviting you to let that memory, that recounting experience, drift into the background, coming back in touch with the sensations of hands to heart in this moment right now. As you're ready, blinking open eyes, letting the light back in, taking a moment to notice how you feel now compared to a few minutes ago. I invite you to practice the self-compassion break whenever you are encountering suffering or difficulty in your life. Thanks for practicing.